Great. And okay, so John Vervaeke, Doshin, Michael Nelson. It's such a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Great pleasure to meet you too. I've been looking forward to this. I mean, it's unfortunate that circumstances that sort of speeded up our ability to get together, because we had planned this for later on, but the world, I don't know, is this the right verb? The world cooperated in an unexpected way and afforded us getting together earlier. So I'm grateful for that, at least.
I'm just grateful that things worked out the way they're supposed to, and I'm not in the way.
Yeah.
So I notice we do have some things in common that I'd just like to mention.
Please.
You have a love of Tai Chi.
Yep.
And I have a martial arts background. I ran a chain of judo and karate schools in New York City.
Cool.
And you have an interest in cognition.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so excited. I don't know that I've ever talked to a cognitive scientist.
Mm.
So I'm really excited for this conversation because I have an interest, but I don't have any of the background that you have. So I'm quite curious where you'll go with some of the crazy ideas that I might throw into the stream.
Well, good. I'm looking forward to that. I like that a lot.
And I just, I've got no agenda. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
So meaning seems to be a really important theme for you.
Yes. Yes.
Isn't that interesting? It's not that important a theme for me. And that's something I'd really like to talk about because I think just that conversation will be so full of aliveness.
Sure.
And that may be another word I have for meaning. It's called aliveness.
It might be. It might be. I was going to suggest that, but let's come around to that. So why do I think it's important? I think it's important because for me, meaning seems to be central to cognition, very much, at least the way I argue we should understand meaning. It's central to being a cognitive agent. And I think that meaning also is central to people's existential well-being, in that meaning understood as this connectedness seems to be very predictive of a lot of mental health outcomes. It seems to be preventative of suicide. It seems to be predictive of people's ability to form long-term lasting relationships, etc. So for me, I'm going to connect to three things. Two things that it connects right away are sort of what I see as the guts of cognition and the guts of existential well-being. I want to be clear about that. I want to use that term not just to mean what's typically called subjective well-being, which is just sort of a sense of contentedness with your life. I'm talking about a deeper notion, more along the lines that Aristotle talked about. And then meaning also seems to be central to unethical/spiritual. We can play with the adjectives later. I'm just throwing out an umbrella category, experiences that people have. So people find that these meanings are the most real for them. And that's not just hollow. They feel called by that sense of realness to engage in very significant and profound transformation of their identities, their roles, their relationships, their careers sometimes. And so for me, if I can understand what I call the machinery of meaning is, I can understand cognition, I can understand existential well-being, and I can understand profound transformation and development. And those three are very interlocking for me as well. So that's why meaning turns out to be central for me.
I wouldn't argue with anything you said, except the underlying assumption that you're assuming it's universal.
So what do you mean by that? I mean, it's universal. It's universal in the sense that I think the processes are universal. I don't think that what people designate as the referent, or what they're talking about, or how they picture or create propositions about this meaning is universal. I think it's that is very culturally and historically varied. Let me give you an analogy.
So let me go a little further before we enter that discussion.
Okay.
Because I'd really like to explain what I mean by that, because I think it's fundamentally important.
Yeah, please.
And it'll add to the conversation.
No doubt.
So I think our capacity to interpret meaning is evolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in different stages of evolutionary development of both individual egos, personalities, as well as the rules and values of different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I think to look at this universality of meaning without really appreciating two things. One, the evolutionary nature of personality and culture,
Mm-hmm.
independently. They're very different processes. And two, understanding that people in different states of awakening have very different relationship to meaning.
Yes.
So those are the two things that I think are not universal, even though I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying or anything you've said. But putting it in that larger context really helps us understand it much more deeply.
Well, that's really kind of pertinent, because the analogy I was going to give you was an evolutionary analogy.
Okay.
And so what I was going to say is, let's take that. I don't think that Darwin's theory is completely exhaustive. That's what the new biology is saying. But let's say it's still what most biologists would argue. It's still central. So what does Darwin's theory give you? Well, it gives you a set of universal principles by which evolution occurs, and those are universal. But it doesn't predict, right, what particular organisms are going to emerge, and neither does it make any normative claim, so that would be in fact ridiculous for it to do so, that any species is cumulative, final, or has finished the process of evolution. And so I do think that meaning is universal in terms of the mechanisms by which it operates. But I think people, as I think you're indicating, can be at very different developmental stages, just the way we can look at, the progress of speciation across the planet during different geological epochs. Though that's not a strict analogy, because I get that the developmental analogy you're talking about is more progressive, and evolution doesn't progress, it just changes. But what I'm trying to say is, I do think it makes a lot of sense to say that there is qualitative change in development, and you can see this even in kids and adults. So you and I don't fall prey to kinds of illusions that children regularly fall prey to. And so there's a change in our competence. We can see through certain illusions, we can latch onto certain patterns that they can't. It's not just that we can gather more kinds of patterns, we're capable, more patterns, I misspoke. We are capable of picking up on more kinds of patterns. We have functions that they do not have. We have emergent functions. But to say that is to just, I think, to say in a different way what I was saying before, that's to say that our cognition is an inherently developmental dynamic process. I don't take meaning to be a static thing. Perhaps that's a property of what people would call semantic meaning, or the meaning of our particular representations. I'm talking about your ongoing, evolving fittedness to your environment, and that people can be at very different stages of that, and they can also have very different products of that. What it is for a child in ancient Greece to be fitted to its environment, I imagine is very different for what it is for me to be fitted to my environment cognitively. And so there's that cultural change. And I also imagine it's very different for me as an adult to be fitted to my environment than the way a child is fitted to their environment. So in both those ways, our cognition is fitted in very different ways to the environment. But nevertheless, I think the mechanisms by which all of this can be explained are the same. That's what I think is universal. That's what I'm trying to argue.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm even interested in having that conversation. I'm a little more practical than that.
Well,
and okay, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying enough to enter into the conversation. So let me just say that as well.
I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to over theorize. I'm just trying to say that there are two ways in which we can talk about how things are universal. We can talk about it in terms of, is it open to scientific investigation? Can we come up with universal processes that explain it, which is different from, is everybody basically the same when we're talking about it? And those aren't the same claims, is what I'm saying. Those aren't the same claims.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you to do something, and I asked Ken Wilber to do this same thing.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm going to ask you to dummy down the conversation a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I'll do my best.
I know this is difficult for you.
No, well, it is, but not in the sense that I find it abrasive. It's something that I want to get better at.
Yeah, me too. And I think once we do that, then we can expand it and make it more complex.
Sure, let's do it that way. I'm happy to do it.
I'd like to meet at a simpler level so that we can meet.
Yeah, that's fine.
I have to admit that you've lost me a little bit.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to do is maybe make it simpler. I'm trying to ask you to renegotiate what we are referring to when referring to meaning.
Okay.
Because perhaps I'm suggesting we're talking at cross purposes about it.
Well, that's entirely possible. And
Yeah.
let me just kind of lay out what is important to me about meaning. I'm a Zen teacher. You know, what I'm concerned about is one thing. I'm not concerned about science. I'm not concerned about scientific knowledge. I'm concerned about helping people awaken.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, I happen to be interested in science.
Yeah.
I happen to be interested in scientific knowledge, but that's not my main job. It's
sure.
Yeah. And people kind of tend to forget that about, you know, Buddhism. It's not intending to be science.
No, and I think it's a mistake to think it is intending to be science.
Boy, amen. You're preaching to the choir there.
Well, this might go towards something, a distinction I make then. Maybe this will get us to a place where we can start talking. I think there's an important distinction that our culture has lost. It's an ancient distinction we need to bring back between two things that are valuable, and they're related, but they're not identical. And this is the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of wisdom. And I take wisdom to be more, you asked me to speak simply, so I'm using that term very broadly.
Great.
I think that wisdom is much more what Zen is concerned about, where science is much more concerned with what knowledge is, with knowledge.
So
and that those two are,
let me ask you a couple questions about that.
Yep.
Because I would say that wisdom is a byproduct. What Zen is really concerned about is insight.
You see, I take it that insight is actually one of the defining and central features of wisdom.
Well, I think you can have insight without wisdom. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing.
So if Zen is about insight, is it about an insight just in a particular situation, or like a comprehensive transformation of the person through
That's where the wisdom comes in.
So do you think Zen is then just affording a moment of insight, and then there is a some sort of process following out of that by which that is transformed into wisdom? Or what would be the point of the insight? I'll ask you a simple question. What would be the point of the insight?
It's a good beginning toward wisdom.
Okay, then I think
when we have deep enough insight that's stable, and this is what's rare. We all have insights all day long, but a stabilization of be able to stay in the moment that is both infinitely spacious, timeless, and has a sense of all at onceness.
Yes. Yeah.
All the karma of everything that's ever been is here now. All the potentiality of everything that's ever been is here now, and it's all accessible. Once this state is becoming stable, and I want to just say at this point that I don't know anybody that's completely enlightened. I'm certainly not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But once it becomes relatively stable, then it's possible to have the heart break open in spontaneous insight, spontaneous compassion, and the marriage of these two, of insight and compassion, to me, is what we're talking about with wisdom.
I think we're in agreement then. That's what I was trying to do. I admit it must have been a little too fast and clumsy when I was talking about the child's development. Because see, a child doesn't have a single insight. When a child goes from one stage of development to another, it has a systematic set of insights, so that state becomes stable. So its default state of mind and cognition shifts. And that's what I was using as an analogy of what I was trying to talk about. In the ancient world, there was a slogan, as the child is to the adult is to the sage. That what you're talking about in developmental terms is something like what I was calling a qualitative change in development, where what's happening is the baseline functioning of the machinery of cognition and consciousness has shifted. But that is natural to human beings. And I don't think Zen would object to me just saying that. I think that that capacity to go through that qualitative change of development is natural to human beings. It's one of our birthrights. It's part of our cognitive machinery. Now, I would go so far as to argue, and I have explicitly, that that ability to go through that is precisely what makes us the kind of intelligent beings we are. So there's deep connection between how our intelligence functions and our capacity for this kind of development. What interests me, and I don't know if you saw, I do a lot of work on these kinds of experiences that you're talking about, where people, I've had, I think I've had things along this line that have had a huge impact in my own personal experience. That's neither here nor there. Well, I'm only mentioning that to make you know that I'm not speaking of this just from the outside.
Mm-hmm. I understand that.
I'm very interested in these experiences, and we've run experiments on it in my lab.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with Daniel P. Brown?
Sorry?
Are you familiar with Daniel P. Brown?
I don't think so. There's a Brown whose work I know.
Daniel Brown is an expert in two areas. He teaches at Harvard Medical School. He teaches psychology. Mm-hmm. This is the popular version of his doctoral thesis, which you might love. It gives me a headache reading it. Pointing out the great way. It is the most detailed, explicit description of meditative states that Westerners have ever come up with.
Well, I will definitely get a hold of it then.
The second area that he's an expert in, which appeals to me even more, is attachment theory.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the first textbook in attachment theory.
Yeah.
It's
now I recognize the name, actually.
Yeah. Now, Daniel, I have to get him to dummy down for me too, just to get us started. Because if he doesn't, I get overwhelmed. But then we can have some really interesting conversation.
Sure.
Daniel, I'm a Zen guy. Mm-hmm. I inherited a prejudice from my teacher. And that's a prejudice for Zen and an allergy for other forms of Buddhism. Mm. And then I had a student kick my ass. I love it when students do that. Those are the students I look for.
Yeah.
And he got me to really see and appreciate how important it is to be able to talk to, a Theravadan Buddhist in language they understand without looking down on them, being prejudiced, I mean. And how important it is to be able to talk to a Zen student, if you're a Theravadan student, without thinking they're an asshole.
Yes.
And Vajrayana, to really appreciate what they see as the third turning of Buddhism and how they integrate them all. And so that sent me back to school, and I'm still working on it. I'm still learning. But one of the things that sent me back to school was I ran into Dan Brown, and it was just so exquisitely enhancing to the way I was looking, particularly at states of mind in awakening. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so between him and Ken Wilber, it just has sent me in a completely different, it's changed everything.
So are you also open to, I think it would have to be if you're talking to Ken, Dan, I don't know very well, but I know Ken Wilber's work a little bit better. Sounds like you are now entering into deep discussions with other wisdom traditions. I mean, because obviously you mentioned Tai Chi, that's a Taoist tradition, and there's a whole Neoplatonic tradition in the West that has very deep roots and very deep things to say about enlightenment and wisdom.
I'm open, and I'm very selective because I'm noticing I'm running out of time. And
Yeah,
I have something that I want to give back that I've spent my whole life acquiring. And I have an expertise in 3 areas: Carl Jung, Ken Wilber, and Zen. And my Zendo is 18 blocks from Ken Wilber's loft. It has been for 15 years. It's not by chance that I named the Sangha Integral Zen. I consider myself a serious student of Ken, and I've spent a lot of time with him. And I would say that I learned integral theory not from his books, but from his mouth. I was very gifted in being invited to a group that met every week, evaluating scholarly articles. And 5 criteria we applied to them. We had to look at each article and see if their presentation of the material in the article was looking through 5 lenses. Are they looking through the 4 quadrants? Are they understanding the evolution of ego structures of consciousness? Do they have a holistic understanding of states of consciousness? Do they understand lines of development or intelligences like cognitive intelligence and spiritual intelligence? And do they have any understanding of typologies? If they presented something that was looking through all of those cognitive lenses, they got this. And if they didn't, they got that, and we had to explain why. This group met every week with Wilber at the helm. And it was the biggest gift I've received in learning integral theory in that context. Was profoundly impactful to me. And it created some problems.
It created problems for you, or?
Well, yes, it did create some problems for me. You know, I'm kind of a type A personality. When I get into Zen, I immerse myself completely. So when I got into Wilber, I got into Wilber completely. And the same problem appeared. You know, I moved from being a Zen zealot to being an integral Zen zealot.
See, that's exactly what interests me as a scientist, if you don't mind me asking that question.
No, I don't mind.
Is exactly what allows you to do that. What allows you to both dive deeply into Zen, dive deeply into integral, and then more importantly, move between them and potentially integrate them together. That to me is
and even more importantly, move out of them.
Yes, move beyond them, move through them in both senses.
So I just didn't want to leave that out.
Yeah, no. I think moving through them.
I can tell you what did that.
Please.
A complete commitment to being totally open, honest, vulnerable, and real, especially if I'm wrong. Man, that is a tough crow to eat for a Zen master.
I can see that. So I'm actually interested in what kinds of practices, skills, and life experiences make those characteristics that you just listed more available and prevalent among people. That's something I'm actually studying and trying to understand. Okay. What is it allows people to get that openness, that flexibility, that humility, that capacity for self-correction and self-transcendence that you've listed? What makes that work? Because there's variance amongst people, obviously. And what are the things that afford, again, people acquiring this, acquiring it better, acquiring it more comprehensively, etc.? I think that's a very important and central question in my work.
I look for one specific thing personally.
Which is
when I'm looking at students and, you know, kind of estimating the degree to which I might be able to help them. I look for one thing, which is what I had. The level of desperation.
How desperate they are?
Yes.
But surely.
As my teacher said, when do we change? When we have to.
I don't know how to respond to that. In that, I think people change for all kinds of reasons. And I think it's also possible for people to be very desperate and to get locked in. This is what some of the work on addiction can points to. I want to know how two equally desperate people, why is it one of them manage it? Two people come back from a hellacious situation that neither you nor I could probably comprehend and are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They're both deeply desperate. Their lives are deeply corroded. One of them stays locked there, and the other one goes through post-traumatic growth. They're both deeply desperate. They're both reaching out consistently for help. And yet one of these individuals makes it out and the other stays locked in. And I want to understand why. And my reasons are not just scientific. My reasons are ultimately humanitarian. I want to understand why, so I can help shift the balance more and more towards the people that make it out and don't remain stuck. I mean, that was one of Jung's great claims, right? People get stuck. And he once said that all of his therapy comes down to helping people get unstuck again. And that's one of the key things I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. Well, you and I have a very common interest and a common heart right there.
Yeah.
And I could talk to you for a long time about that. And I actually have a lot of experience with that because that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more.
Developing please. A toolbox,
right,
to help people with that.
Now we're getting to something where we have something very, very similar, because I'm interested also in assembling that toolbox. And I'm interested in both, if you'll allow me, bottom up and top down versions of people, how that toolbox is assembled. Both are important. Bottom up is people who are in the field, so to speak, and are building it in practice. And then there is people who, like granted, and I do that too. I teach meditation, I teach Tai Chi, I do work with people, and I do work with people who are building communities of practices. But I'm also interested in the top down, which is, doing what science can do for us, which is to study some phenomena, understand it better, and improve how we can make our tools. And that's how we get some of our best physical technology. And so I want to do both. I want to do both and get them so they can talk to each other and respect each other and help each other as much as possible.
I want to do both as well. I found that I'm much more prone to doing one, bottom up.
Of course.
And I'm a little bit of a dictator. I would have made a good shogun. I lived in the wrong era. I should have been a Zen master in the shogun period, because I really like to be in control. I like to tell people what to do and they just go do it. And the only problem with that is it didn't work. And that's what led me out of desperation into being more open, honest, and vulnerable. Yeah. And to my horror, that's the only thing that worked. It's the last thing I wanted to do. But it worked.
Yes.
So what I found for me personally is that if I try to be top down, I just trigger the hell out of people, because that shogun comes out. And in our current cultural situation with the culture wars, that just is not going to work. It's going to get you crucified.
Right.
So I found I had to stop doing that. And the only thing that did work is being open, honest, and vulnerable. But that doesn't mean I'm not interested. That doesn't mean I wouldn't like to have a much clearer understanding and have somebody do some scientific studies, because, my God, those are valuable.
Yes.
The data that comes out of that is huge. So I'm all for you. And I would love to support you in your endeavor on both sides.
Well, thank you. And I feel I reciprocate. I repeatedly say to people who are practitioners that I'm not trying to found anything or start anything. I'm trying to afford facilitating what is already growing.
So can I confess something to you?
Sure.
This is a little embarrassing, But when I got so excited about, combining Zen and integral theory and seeing some results, I'm afraid I turned into what shall I call it? A social activist. Oh my God, did I say that? I was trying to save the world with integral Zen. Oh, horror, horror. If I was a real Zen master, I'd commit seppuku. Thank goodness those days are over.
So was there a next stage when you then encountered attachment theory, and Jung? Or where did Jung come in, and where does attachment theory come in?
Oh, isn't that a great question? My teacher is kind of a troublemaker. I some people are surprised because I'm such a troublemaker that I'd find a troublemaker teacher.
I'm picking that up in our conversation.
He is a really interesting character. He was the head of the windowpane LSD family in the 60s. Mm. His mission was to enlighten the world with LSD. Mm. And then he discovered that didn't work real well. It served the purpose. But then he went to India and studied with Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois and became a real accomplished yogi. Mm-hmm. And then he noticed that they're a little short of meditation. So he started studying with a Japanese Rinzai Zen master and became a Zen master.
Right.
And there was only one problem. His teacher said, there is no Zen outside of Japanese culture. And he went, oh, don't say that. I'm not Japanese. So he went on to prove his teacher wrong and to create a Zen in the West. And he took the koan training of Rinzai Zen and he modernized it. He did something very similar to what Dan Brown has done. And Dan has done this because he was asked by the Dalai Lama to do something that the Dalai Lama failed to do, which is teach advanced Mahamudra and Dzogchen meditation to Westerners. Mm-hmm. The Dalai Lama stopped doing that because they just aren't willing to do the preliminary practices to even get ready to learn the advanced techniques. And we have the same trouble in Zen. So what Jumpo did was he did something that's forbidden in traditional Zen. He started leading people with language to the insight that normally is only arises with no help in an individual mind, the insight of koan training. What is Wu? What is nothingness? Who are you? What is the sound of one hand? What is your face, your true face, before your parents were born? All these enigmatic questions that thinking mind can't answer. The right hemisphere opens. Mm-hmm. And the left hemisphere we have to tie it in knots before the right hemisphere can open, to borrow a phrase from McGillichrist.
Yeah, Ian and I had a very good conversation not that long ago.
Yeah, I was jealous. I really want to talk to him too. You and him, I want to talk to him.
So, but I interrupted. So your master learned how to use language to get people to this rather than just sort of
he learned how to do something forbidden in traditional koan training, to
right.
give people clues and use language to lead them into deeper states of temporary awakened mind.
Right.
And Daniel Brown is doing the same thing. He's a hypnotherapist.
Right.
So his wife told me one time, oh, he's just hypnotizing us awake. And literally that's what he's doing. He's leading with language and then following up. Because once you have a taste of the experience, now you have to you have to continue to deepen that experience and then stabilize.
Yeah.
So let me just begin with, that is one of the things that I use. I call it Wu technology. And then we get to the places where we're stuck, like you talked about a moment ago, right?
Yes.
And for me, I've had to examine the whole spectrum of shadow work. This begins with karma and family karma. And then it moves into trauma. Being born is really traumatic. And then all the pre-verbal trauma and the early attachment issues that manifest. And then we move into all of a sudden language development and ego development that begins with language. And then we move into the developmental trauma. You know, this is our parents trying to civilize us, to get us prepared to live in the world they think we're going to live in.
And so this is where all the Jung comes in, is at that point.
Well, it's not just Jung, it's also Wilber.
Wilber.
It's you know, Jung wasn't very developmentally oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Erich Neumann, who was Jung's most brilliant student and Wilber's favorite Jungian, as well as your contemporary Jordan Peterson loves Neumann, because he really was developmental. The Origins and History of Consciousness was his magnum opus.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, he had several. So putting it in a developmental perspective and including the deity level of the archetypes, or you could say the Yogacara teachings of Buddhism, the mind-only teachings, which is what really esoteric Buddhism is about. You know, it has the storehouse, which is, you know, I found in Jung's collected works, I found a reference to the Lankavatara Sutra, which is where the Buddha, allegedly, of course, described, the only description of mind was the 8 consciousnesses in the Lankavatara Sutra. A very complete description of mind that evolved, you know, and so this is where I get really excited. And this is where I really would love to run some of these crazy ideas that I've been playing with by a real cognitive scientist and see what he has to say about it.
I'm open to that. So I just want to make a comment. I think this aligns with something I've been arguing for quite a bit. I talk a lot about, because it sounds to me like you're doing this, an ecology of practices.
Yes.
Where you have a bunch of sets of practices that are in a dynamic developmental relationship with each other and act as checks and balances and have respective strengths and weaknesses. And you try to get this ecology of practices going, because that's actually the best way for human beings to go through significant transformational development.
It's been my experience.
It's been my experience too. This is one of the instances where I think the bottom-up experience and the top-down theory are converging. I think they're converging on both towards this conclusion that this is the optimal way of trying to afford human transformation.
Yeah, and I notice something gets in the way of that.
Which is what?
You know, McGillichrist would call it the emissary thinking he's a master.
Yeah. But Ian's also aware of the fact that the reverse can be the problem too, right?
Say more about that. Help me see what you're pointing to.
So what you can, there could be a tendency to overvalue the right hemisphere.
Of course.
Right. Well, that's exactly it.
So let me just take that and let me include what you're pointing to there in what I'm talking about, the whole spectrum of consciousness.
Sure, please.
Wilber said something that just troubled the shit out of me, and I had to really dig into it, and I had to question him, and I had to, in the Religions of Tomorrow, he says, shadows are addictions and allergies in both states and structures of mind, and what drives them. So what drives them is the karma and the attachment issues and the trauma and the shock trauma and developmental trauma. And then the shadows are actually addictions and allergies in structures of consciousness, which are these levels of development that the developmental theorists are pointing to, each in their own way, and states of consciousness. So I can get addicted to a left hemisphere way of thinking, and I can be allergic to a right hemisphere way of thinking, or converse. So that's what you're pointing to. But it's not just left and right hemisphere, it's everything. I can get addicted to scientific inquiry.
Yes.
I can get allergic to scientific inquiry. Neither one of them are very healthy or useful.
No, I agree with that. And I don't think it's just left and right. I mean, I talked to Ian about this. It's also, you know, the front and the back of the brain, the top and the bottom right? It's a multi-dimensional.
Everything.
There's lots of different variations that have to be taken into account.
Yes.
I suppose, I guess what you have me at a bit of a disadvantage, like I said, because I don't have a lot of familiarity with Wilbur's work. So
That's all right. I won't hold that against you.
Thank you. I mean, I do a lot of work in development. I teach courses on cognitive development. I teach courses on development itself, overall psychological development. And I guess what I wanted to ask is that where, because attachment theory, it's the classic version of from Bowlby, comes out of a particular developmental model too. Mm-hmm. And is that where you got the stuff on attachment theory out of the sort of the psychological work on? I mean, because we should be clear that we're using attachment here as it's used in attachment theory, not as the term is typically used within Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that when Wilbur says addictions, analogies, and states and structures, when I talk about attachment theory, I'm talking about Bowlby. I'm talking about what evolved out of Bowlby. Yeah. And that's what Daniel Brown is really addressing beautifully.
Yeah, my friend and colleague at U of T, Jeff McDonald, he has a wonderful way of putting this. He says that with respect to relationships, romantic and otherwise, attachment theory is the way, the truth, and the life. So if you don't know attachment theory, you're not going to be able to explain human relationships. And I take that argument very, very seriously.
Well, I've found other psychological models that actually do a fairly adequate job. I don't think they're as good as attachment theory. I use attachment theory, but I use other. For example, Hal Stone was a Jungian analyst. He instigated a technique that he calls voice dialogue. Mm. And it's very effective. And after you've done voice dialogue with someone and they've explored some of their voices of their subpersonalities, some known and some unknown.
I'm aware of similar practices, yeah.
Yeah, then you start getting into the parental bonding patterns. And these are infinite loops. And what you discover is, holy shit, I married my mother. And you're right in that heat of attachment theory without the attachment theory. It's another way of dealing with this stuckness in a way that brings it into the light and you can transcend, go beyond it.
So when you're working with people then, this is very interesting to me. When you're working with people then, like, are you teaching them, like Zazen, you're teaching them sit and practice? Are you also teaching them this voice psychotechnology you just talked about? Are you teaching them shadow work, active imagination? Like, what does it mean practically to do something to you that you're often doing to me? What does that mean practically? What does that mean practically? Like,
it means primarily, first of all, meeting them where they are.
Mm-hmm, of course.
Now, to me, Wilbur has redefined what awakening means. It used to be enough just to wake up, but that's not true anymore. Now we need to grow up. We need to continue to evolve and not get stuck in an evolutionary stage of development. So we need to wake up, really important, to me, the most important, but I'm a Zen guy, forgive me, in advance.
Okay, please continue.
I apologize, but I'm not sorry for being a Zen guy.
No, I understand what you're doing. Please continue.
So waking up, growing up, then Wilbur says cleaning up, doing all this shadow and trauma work is essential. And I would add the karma. You got to clean up the karma too. Mm. And then you can show up as a whole integrated, healthy human being. And I've had to add one between growing up and cleaning up. You know what it is? I added it right here. And I'm going to be crude. Forgive me and forgive I'm not sorry, but please forgive me in advance. You have to include fucking up. Mm-hmm. And then you have to clean it up just as quickly as possible. And this is because if you aren't free to make mistakes, you will be frozen in fear, unable to learn, unable to grow, unable to awaken. And, this is where Jonathan Haidt and his moral psychology and the data they've accumulated, he says that postmodern Postmodern culture is two isms, victimism and safetyism. That's horrendous. And there's a Buddhist teacher by the name of Stephen Levine. He's
I know. Yeah, I've got some of his books.
Isn't he great? So he said, safety is the most unsafe spiritual path you can take. It leaves you frozen in fear, unable to take risks, unable to learn and grow.
I think that's important, and I think that's why we don't talk about the virtue of courage anymore, and we've misunderstood what courage means. We've taken courage to mean some sort of fortitude or a lack of fear. I think courage means the ability to actually face failure and to not let fear distort you pursuing what needs to be done. And I think the fact that our culture doesn't talk about courage other than in a kind of a Rambo-esque fashion is one of the criticisms I would make of the culture right now. I don't know if I totally agree with Jonathan's take on postmodernism. I do agree that those two things, and his work he's done on sort of helicopter parenting in the 80s and the effects that's had. I definitely see that, and I definitely see the argument he's making. I think there's more going on in postmodernism than those two things, which brings me around to, I guess, a more general point I had, which is, how did you decide upon these particular set of thinkers? This was a very postmodern question to ask you. How did you settle upon these thinkers, right? Like Jung and
That's a
Wilber.
great question. I want to just pause for a minute and appreciate that question. Is that what you cognitive guys do, is ask questions like that? That's a Zen question.
Well, that's what I do. And a good cognitive scientist, part of my work is to show that way before you should solve your problem, you should step back and pay a lot of attention to how you're formulating your problem, how you're asking your question, and what is being made salient, what's being foregrounded, what's being backgrounded in the questioning itself. And then the philosophical influence for that is like Heidegger. So that's where my particular way of doing that comes from.
Mm-hmm. So I want to appreciate that as a skill, and I'd like to learn how to do that. So I'm just warning you.
No, I think that's right, because I think how we choose our sages are more than teachers. Sages are, I'm using the term to be the way you are describing your relationship to Jung and Wilber. You've deeply internalized their work. You just don't believe it. You do more than that. It's not just a set of claims for you. It's adverbial for you. It's become a way of seeing for you.
So let me answer that question as briefly as I can, which won't be real brief. But at 17 years old, I was really screwed up. Mm-hmm. You know, I had tons of anger. I was too smart for my own good. I was too intuitive for my own good, and I was too independent for my own good. And I was really screwed up teenager, and I had no friends. I was isolated. I lived in a very small town in rural Colorado, and it's a town that was in a big isolated mountain valley that never came out of the Great Depression psychologically.
Oh,
and it was a Leave It to Beaver town. You know, until I became a teenager, it was a wonderful place to be raised. A friend of mine noticed that I was writing a poem, and he just thought I was a dumb white kid with a hot car because I loved cars. And when he read the poem, he was shocked. And he said, "You've got to come meet a teacher of mine." So he drugged me to meet this teacher that had deeply impacted him at 17. I knocked on the door. We drove 2 miles to get to this teacher. It was an old mansion with a turret. It was incredible. And, you know, I had goosebumps. And I didn't know why. So I'm knocking on the door at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. And this white-haired woman with fire in her eyes opens the door. And she said, "Welcome. No one comes here by chance. We're guided by the unconscious, because the unconscious knows." I was hooked. We stayed for about 8 hours. Time flew like that. And my life changed forever. I asked this one woman, and I kept going back. She just blew me away. She introduced me to Carl Jung, Miriam Eliade, Joseph Campbell, Hermann Hesse, D.T. Suzuki, Krishnamurti, to name but a few. And all of a sudden, this isolated kid had friends, had people that thought like he thought.
Yes, yes.
He wasn't crazy, or not too crazy. So I asked this woman in one of the visits, I said, why are you teaching it, people like me this? And she said, well, my sole purpose in life is to aid young men on their cultic journey. And my cultic journey began when I met Mrs. Nevin. Mm. And I started looking for who are the heroes, not of this age, of the next age. Who are the Galileos and the Newtons that are unseen and unrecognized? Mm-hmm. And I began looking for them. And I continued to look for them in graduate school when I finally made it, which took me about 15 years. And I came up with Jung and Bateson and Bucky Fuller. Yeah. These are Whitehead. These are the ones that struck me. I never ran into Heidegger then. Still haven't read Heidegger. I'm quite curious. Mm-hmm. So when I ran into Wilber's work in 2002, I hadn't met him yet, but I realized that he was the Newton of the next age. His conceptual framework was so far ahead of anybody in this age that he wouldn't be recognized until this world comes to an end and the next one rises out of the ashes.
Did he remind you of, what was her name, Miss Neville?
No, not at all. I mean,
very different.
Very different. You know, her sole function was to help young men like me, mm-hmm. their cultic journey. I mean, that really was her purpose in life. And she was very knowledgeable. She'd spent the last 40 years reading 8 hours every day religiously. But humanities was her area of study. You know, not science, not other areas. It was humanities. You know, when I finally did meet Wilbur, I was shocked. I expected this huge intellect to meet me at the door. And this incredible open heart is what met me and connected to me. He met me where I am, in that heart.
So I'm trying to, what's the connection between the two? Is it that in both of them you met somebody that met you at the level of the heart? Like, what is it that's guiding you in selecting the people? That's what I'm trying to figure
out. Intuition. It is.
Can you say a little bit more?
You know, I'd love to say more because, you know, the one thing that I would really like to run by a cognitive scientist is what I call the cognitive matrix rather than the cognitive line of development. Mm-hmm. And we're back to the conversation about insight. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar at all with Jung's theory of types?
Very.
Wonderful. Perfect.
I've been through Jungian therapy.
Wonderful. Wonderful. You know, the therapist that I spent the most time with was from Bombay. She was an anthropologist from India.
Right.
What a juxtaposition of cultural. She'd look at me and she'd just shake her head. So, Jung's theory of types, we have 4 cognitive functions. And I call them cognitive. I don't know if you would. Mm-hmm. And to me, let me just define what I mean by cognition. And, you know, you can take exception. You can educate me later. But just so for clarity.
Sure.
To me, cognition is how we get information and how we use it to make decisions. Mm-hmm. How we make decisions with it. That's cognition. And that may be simplistic, but.
No, it's close enough to what I would say. So go ahead.
Wonderful. So we have 4 cognitive functions, according to Jung. We have 2 functions by which we gather information. One of them is sensation, and by that he means the 5 senses, not the 6 that we have in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And then the second cognitive function by which we gather information is intuition. And that's the immediate knowing, gnosis, of the Gnostics. This immediate knowing that sees around corners, transcends time and space. Then we have two cognitive functions by which we gather information. And this is where it really ties into the sixth sense consciousness of Buddhism, thought and fuzzy thought. So to Jung, these two functions are thinking and feeling. But in German, the language is much more precise than English. By feeling, he means very specifically liking and disliking. That cognitive function by which we get a feel for these things I like, therefore I'm going to do these things I don't like, therefore I'm not going to do those.
Yeah.
It's a decision-making function. So these four functions is what I used to pick my professors in college. I knew that I was intuitive, off the charts intuitive. I knew that if I had an empirical teacher, that I wouldn't get an A. And I was very driven to get straight A's by the time I finally made it back to college. And so I used his theory of types to pick my college professors, to maximize the chances of me getting an A. And it worked beautifully.
Right.
Using Wilber's quadrants, we have an inside and an outside, left and right quadrants. We have singular and plural. The four quadrants, in my view, Jung's theory of types laid the groundwork for the four quadrants to manifest in the world. In my view, this is just my own quirky thinking. But you can use the quadrants as a typology in a very similar way that I use Jung's typology. And it's very similar in the predictability and the ability to make sense out of things. And I mean make sense, not meaning. Make sense out of things that weren't predictable before. They become predictable. And so to me, I talk about, instead of Wilber talks about a cognitive line of development, which is cognitive intelligence, which you are an expert in, I talk about a cognitive matrix. We have these four functions that are all part of our cognition. And it's important to really look at the dynamic juxtaposition. What happens when an introverted intuitive meets an extroverted empirical type, and that dynamics becomes really important in our understanding of whether we're going to get along or not. I notice I'm excited. I'm moving my hand.
So let me try and make sure I understand you. So you basically crafted from Jung's typology with integrated with Wilber a way of picking up on people that you thought would be excellent teachers. Is that what you're saying?
Not excellent teachers.
Okay.
More likely to give me an A. This is much more selfish than that.
Okay, but how did that translate into you being able to pick the people that, like Wilber and Jung? How did that?
So I'm looking for the people that are brilliant and are 3 clicks out. Their brilliance is not likely to be recognized in this time. Their brilliance won't be recognized until after they're dead. And Wilber wants to be recognized as a brilliant philosopher now. And my sense is that's not going to happen. His brilliance is not going to be recognized until after he's gone. And after whatever happens in this world falling apart happens. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball, but things are getting kind of crazy. I don't know if you've noticed.
I have. I have. I've talked about that quite a bit. So I'm still zeroing in on this, and I think I appreciate you saying this is a good question, because I keep coming back to mine. So what's the connection between those strategies you used for getting the A giving teachers, and then your ability to pick up on the people who have the future of brilliance?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a direct connection. I'm sure there's an indirect correct. The thing that I'm looking who are the troublemakers? Who are the Galileos that are almost to get burned at the stake? You know, Bruno got burned, Galileo didn't. It was just a tiny difference that was the difference between Galileo getting burned at the stake and not.
But you don't just mean somebody who's an iconoclast, because there's been lots of iconoclasts.
So what does iconoclast mean?
An iconoclast is somebody who just wants to like challenge the tradition and
No.
with the authorities. Right. I know that.
I'm looking for the people that have the boon that will reinvigorate the world in exactly the sense of the cultic journey. Who are those heroes who...
There's a connection. Yeah. There's the connection you just made. So expand on that, please. What you just said there.
I spent my entire life terrified that I was going to miss the call to adventure. And not until I became a Zen master, an equanimous, at least to some degree, that I realized, oh my God, my whole life has been my cultic journey.
Right.
I've been on this cultic journey. That's been the function of my whole life, to find these very teachers who are bringing back the boon that will reinvigorate the world.
Right.
Jung, Wilber, Bucky Fuller.
And so you recognize them. You recognize this boon because you get a sense of how it connects you, right? I'm trying to figure out, like...
Yeah. This is not personal, although, of course, it has personal ramifications.
Right. I'm not trying to make it egocentric. In fact, that's the last thing I want. But you're the person I'm talking to, so I'm asking you with personal language.
Yeah, but I love the question still. Please drill my ass.
I don't know if I'd put it that way, but okay. So, I like, because this is what I, this is really, central, pedagogically, existentially central, is how you're looking for, because you said that it's ultimately intuition, and I'm trying, and you're helping me, and I appreciate it. I'm trying to unpack what goes into this intuition, what are its components, what's its history, how is it working in you, because I want to understand it. Because that, to me, when we get past the science and the religion, we're trying to get at how do we find the people and the practices that will make the difference that we believe, hopefully with good reason, is needed. That's, for me, the central question, and that's what I'm sort of probing you on. I hope you're not finding it too intrusive.
Oh, I don't. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. You can't find. I will never find you too intrusive. The best approach with an 8 is a 2x4 right here.
So it would be possible. Can I just ask one question then? It would be possible for somebody to have a different set of ecologies of practice. They may come out of a Christian tradition, and instead of Jung, maybe they are deeply influenced by, Meister Eckhart, and they could also have this configuration, and nevertheless it could give them the same kind of thing that you're talking about. That's reasonable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is beyond any kind of belief system.
Yes. That's what I was talking about way at the beginning when I was using all that verbiage. When I was talking about this capacity. Yeah, but that's it. That's what I mean about this. This evolving fittedness, and that's what you're doing. You there, and you can say there. That fits. That's where I belong. That's what I'm interested in. That.
Yeah, me too.
Yes.
And I love the way you're clarifying it and articulating it with language. Oh my God, this is great.
Well, I'm part of what I'm doing in my main project right now, and I really appreciate you joining me here, because we're exemplifying the very thing. I call it dialogos, which is this idea of, not just discussion, not just conversation, but what we're doing here, right? We're trying to bring, articulation and language, but not strict argumentation. We're not ignoring argumentation either, but we're not limiting ourselves. We're doing this thing where we're trying to bring out, we're trying to articulate in both senses of the word, come to terms, and in both making terms and also coming to terms with the phenomena, like in both senses of the word. We're trying, and I'm very interested in there's a lot of emerging practices around this right now. I'm very deeply involved with Guy Senstock and circling and other things like this that are trying to figure out what's going on in these conversations, such that we can get people into the resonance that you and I are now experiencing right now. That to me is also something that is very needed. That's why I'm so interested in the work that I'm doing with Rebel Wisdom, because all of their stuff about collective intelligence and trying to get people to talk to each other in a new way, in a way that gives priority to emergence rather than to established ideas.
So I've done a lot of work with the circling people.
Yeah.
And, both in Europe and here. And
where are you, by the way?
I live in Denver.
Okay.
And before the virus, I'm supposed to be in Amsterdam right now leading a retreat, and then there was one in New Hampshire. Yeah. I mean, I have a full schedule that we had to cancel, all of them. So now I'm going to start doing stuff on the internet because, everybody's doing that. And I've been doing it for quite a while. I found it extremely helpful.
Yes.
I have a very different view than anybody else that I've met when it comes to the difference between individual intelligence and collective, which I have trouble. I stumble over the word collective intelligence. It's an oxymoron to me. There is intelligence, but it's not in the collective. It's in the individuals. That's a whole nother conversation, and I don't really want to get sidetracked in it because
I would want to challenge you on that, but let's not get sidetracked on it. Let's
it's a conversation I would love to have with you and love to get into detail, but I think it's another day because we're doing so good right now.
Yeah, let's keep going with our line. I like it.
Wilber talks about, and I can't remember which theorist he got this from. It was one of the philosophy of science guys. But he talks about the dominant monad. Individuals have dominant monads. They have the capacity for volition and choice. Yeah, cultures don't have dominant monads. They have dominant modes of communication. So that's all I'll say about that, but it changes everything when you really drill down into that. And then you tie in Durkheim. When Durkheim talks about this collective spread of emotion, which is what happens when you get people together and do sacred things, he called it collective effervescence. It's the emotion that spreads through the crowd. Like go to a football game and you'll see that if your team's winning, everybody's elated. If your team's losing, everybody's crushed. That collective emotion that spreads like a virus through a group. Wilhelm Reich called that emotional plague. He loved the negative terms that kind of stop people. Like masochist, a masochist character type. It's got nothing to do with real masochism, but it kind of stops people and they want to know what it is. And Carl Jung called that participation mystique, which he borrowed from Levi Bruhl.
Levi Bruhl, yeah.
So this is the participation in the collective mystery and the collective emotion that goes through, sweeps through the bliss state that sweeps through a crowd. These are just things that fascinate me and I think are so timely right now. And they go to the heart of trying to understand, predict, and explain the culture wars and what the hell we can do about them.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, so I'll just stop.
Well, but what I was pointing to is a phenomena that I thought we were exemplifying, which is when you're in a good dialogue with somebody, you can come to insights in places you can't get to on your own. And that can be mutually shared between two people. There's something, I find that often in a discussion that's not one of just imposing my belief or seeking agreement, but what we're actually doing here, I will often come to insights that I wouldn't find on my own, and people report the same thing happening. And I'm interested in exactly that. I'm interested in how we can cooperate. And I think that is a very important word, and we got to remember what that really means, to bring about those kinds of emergent insights. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with anything that you said. I'm just a little skeptical, and I would get very curious. I want methodology of testing to see whether we're really having the same insights.
So what would you mean by methodology of testing? Do you mean that you and I have come to similar sets of judgments of what's relevant or important? What do you mean?
No, I really mean, this teacher that I met at 17, she introduced the concept of becoming more conscious. Never occurred to me that I could become more conscious. So immediately I asked her an innocent question. I said, how do I become more conscious?
Right.
And her answer was, she says, oh, nobody's ever asked me. Let me look. And she stopped and she got quiet. And she said, the only way I know to become more conscious is to constantly ask myself, what do I mean when I say that?
Mm-hmm.
So, that was a kind of a problem, because I started doing that and I never stopped.
But I'm interested right there. And you provoked in her something that she had not ever done before or even considered doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then she said something that she had not obviously said before.
That's co-creation. Something co-creatively happened, which is a beautiful thing, which is your point.
Yes, that's my point. That's my point.
I completely agree. And I'm a little skeptical. When we get all excited, I want to say, well, what was your insight? I want to make sure it's the same insight I had.
Oh, no, of course. I'm not saying we run with, I wasn't. I hope I didn't miscommunicate. I wasn't proposing some sort of romantic enthusiasm. I wasn't saying we should just run with however we're enthusiastic. It should be, we're doing it. We're doing it. There should all the moments of creation are interposed, hopefully fluently, with moments of self-correction, which is what we're doing right now as well. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Now you got me. Now there's a feedback loop. That's all I was asking for.
Yeah, exactly. And that's for me, that's the Socratic model, where you're trying to get this optimal integration between the co-creation and the co-correction. maybe we'll see.
Well, we'll see. It'll break down at some point. They always do.
Well, of course.
But we just came together in a really important way, and you have a complete functioning system that you just shared with me that alleviated my skepticism, because that's what lack of feedback is, death.
Oh, well, totally. Totally. That's where my training as a scientist matters, because if you don't run the experiment and get the feedback, and if the feedback can't show you that you're wrong, then you're not running a good experiment and you're not doing good science. So that's exactly right. I totally agree.
Yeah.
So we've got about 10 more minutes. I kind of like where we've gotten to so far. We have some other topics we could explore at length. Are there anything we could bring up in the last 10 minutes or so?
Well, I just want to express gratitude and appreciation for the fact that we could even have this conversation that could be so fruitful and open. That's rare.
Yeah.
And I want to just appreciate it.
Me too. I want to flag what you just said, the rarity of it. We have too much of people shouting each other down and debunking and destroying. And I'm really not interested in that. I'm really interested in people who want to enter into this kind of deep dialogue. It's very important to me. It's a principle that I live by. And so I appreciate somebody who, this sounds sort of self-referential, but I appreciate somebody who can appreciate it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Life is too short.
Painfully too short. And what the events of today are making that even more salient to us.
What a Dharma gate this is. I'm so excited. Who would have thought a little virus could be such a big Dharma gate?
Well, this won't be the last one of these we face either.
Yeah.
I mean, the biological models probably indicate we'll probably be facing more of these with, you know,
Yeah.
with some increasing frequency.
Yeah. I'd like to share a poem I wrote in graduate school.
Please.
As I was exiting graduate school.
What did you study in graduate school?
I got in a program that theoretically allowed me to get a Master of Social Science degree and roam the whole gamut. And I found that the prejudices that I encountered prohibited that ideal from happening.
You're talking to somebody who's by nature in an interdisciplinary program, and I know what you're talking about. At least I have something deeply similar in my own background.
Oh, excellent. That's a whole nother conversation.
Very much.
Yeah. And I'm looking for the poem real quickly. It's got to be out there on this huge Mac.
Well, while you're doing that, hopefully this won't interfere with your processing. I'd be happy to have another discussion with you. I really enjoyed this, and I thought it was
did too, and I am in. I'm so ready to do that. So, are you familiar with William Blake? I thought you might be.
Yes, I quote him often in my series, and I quote him.
I heard that.
Yeah, I do the To See a World on a Grain of Sand. I do that one. Yes.
The Garden of Love. Have you ever run across that?
I believe so. I've read a lot of Blake.
Yeah. So I'm just going to start with a little talking about this poem, and I'll be happy to share it with you if you'd like to. In fact, if you'd like to read it, that'd be all right too.
Well, sure.
Okay, let me just share it with you and everybody else. So there's the Garden of Love. Do you see it?
Yes, I do.
Why don't you read it for us?
The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love to see what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. Oh, I remember this now. But the gates of the chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that's so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Yes.
You want to take a stab at the next one?
Sure. This is by you?
Yes.
I went to the castle of knowledge to see what I had never learned. The bricks and the mortar were crumbling, hearts where compassion once burned. Huh. But the minds of my professors seemed opened, and know thyself hung over the door. So I entered the castle of knowledge, and I asked them what causes war. And I saw it was filled with fools, opinions where insight should be. Good doctors in college were blinded by knowledge, eschewing my queries with second-hand theories. That's very good. And I like the performative allusion to Blake's poem. Well done. Very well done, by the way.
So, back to your question that you were drilling me. Why? Why did you become obsessed with these particular theorists?
Yep.
What's even deeper than that in my heart is this question that's been with me since the beginning of my memory. Why is there war? This is what has driven me to become a Zen master. I left graduate school because they didn't have a clue. The answer wasn't found there. And I stumbled into a real Zen teacher who kicked my ass. And I discovered the cause of all my problems, all my wars. You know what the problem is? You know what the cause is?
What?
Me.
Yeah, that's very Socratic.
So that wanting to end war and then finally realizing that I have to end it in myself before I can end it anywhere, or even contribute to an ending of war. Yeah. This is even deeper driver for me than wanting to find the teachers that have something to bring back that will rejuvenate the world.
So for you, then, the rejuvenating the world is actually in service to this ameliorating or perhaps removing war. Have I understood you correctly?
Well, I want to be careful with those words because I've created a process that is in my toolbox that's the most effective tool I have.
Yeah.
And of course, it's what worked on me. It's called conflict liberation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And ironically, conflict liberation is not about ending conflict. It's about using conflict to liberate.
This sounds very similar to what I talk about in moving from adversarial processing to opponent processing. I think we could have an extended discussion about this.
Oh, we should play together.
Yeah, that sounds very, very, very similar. Very similar.
So, it's been such a pleasure, John Vervaeke. It exceeded any expectations I might have had that I didn't have.
This was really, really wonderful for me. I found this, like I said, for me, this is true dialogos. I found that there was, I loved the back and forth and the restructuring and the challenge and the connection. It was, in many ways, inviting me to do this again with you.
Me too. I'm in.
Well, let's make it happen.
Okay, I'm in. We got nothing but time. Nowhere to go.
Well, for me, I still have to do most of my work at the university. I just have to do it all virtually now.
Me too.
Yeah. So
I don't get any break. I still got to be teaching. I just do it virtually, just like you.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So, but we do seem to have more flexibility in our schedules. So that should afford us being able to talk again.
Amen.
Okay. Well, I should
Deepest
go.
Gratitude.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to our next conversation. I'll upload this onto my channel, and
great. I'll probably upload it onto our YouTube channel, if that's all right with you.
Of course. And what I was going to ask is, please send me any links or notes.
Absolutely.
So I'll put it on the notes for our video together.
Yeah, I didn't take any notes. Sorry.
Well, then, but anything you might want to point your viewers to, or point my viewers to.
Yeah, and yes, you do the same, and I'm happy to do that. And it's just Integrals N. That's it.
Okay. Take care, my friend. Very nice meeting you.
Till next time. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, till next time. Stay healthy.
Okay, that's a deal. You too.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.